It's not an easy place to be, to write a horror film. You go downstairs to the dark to find these characters. It's not a place anyone can go, and sometimes it's not a place you want to go. Wes Craven. Wes Craven is not only a director or a writer, he's a nightmare inflictor. A man who manipulated the safest places in the imaginations of our minds. His artwork reigns on even after his death and still inspires millions to make sure that their door is locked and to always keep a light on. On today's episode of the Sloppy Horror Podcast, I'll be discussing Wes Craven and his influence over the genre, and how his 30-year dynasty shaped how scary movies would be made forever. When I kind of started this show, I really wanted to start at the beginning of horror films, and I wanted to see how they got here and why the hell they were here and what made them so great. If you guys listened to my episode Bullets to Popcorn, which if you didn't get a chance to check out, you definitely should, we discussed on how World War I and all war heavily influenced horror films and really the start of them, and how all wars to follow after that would really, just be fuel to the fire. So, today, we'll be discussing one of the pioneers who made it out. A phoenix who made it out of the fire. Of all of these things that America was going through. And that man's Wes Craven. I don't really even think you can range how much he's had, how much of his brain and how much of his love for horror films is still, and it just has such a strong hold on the genre. So, Wes Craven was born in 1939 in Cleveland. He was born to a pretty religious mother. His father died at a young age, so his mom was very religious, and he had a very strict household. Wes Craven really didn't get to watch many movies or watch any film unless it was G-rated. So, if you could imagine being born in 1939, so being a young man during World War II, kind of getting older, and when you're becoming a man and an adult, this country is going through things that are pretty radical. We have the Vietnam War starting to spark when he's in his 20s, and as I discussed in that Bullets to Popcorn, Vietnam had a lot of films it had a lot of films come out right after, because it was crazy what the country was going through, and people represented how they felt in different ways, and some people decided to make some splatter flicks, and I'm definitely appreciative for it. And one of these people that have made it out is Wes Craven. So, Wes Craven really tried to stay pretty straight-laced, and he didn't even want to be a director, to be honest. He wanted to be a writer. He loved to write, because even though his mother kept film from him, he was always allowed to read. So he found scary stories in other ways. So he did the good thing. Once he got out of high school, he went to college, and he ended up making it to Johns Hopkins, and he finished there. And when he got out, he was teaching people, so he had a pretty straight-laced approach to things. Not as liberal arts as he could be. And crazy enough, he had like an infection in his spine, and it paralyzed Wes from the chest down. Wes got paralyzed, and after he was actually bedridden for about 2 months, and after that whole ordeal, it threw Wes into horror films, wanting to make scary films. And it's kind of one of those moments where you're like, damn, I'm not very happy that something like that could happen to somebody, but If that's the end result and all of it, hey, I wouldn't take it back. So, you have a young man, Wes Craven, in the 60s. You know, he's seeing if you missed the episode Bullets to Popcorn, we also talked about how the Vietnam War was played at home on TV. So it was a real life horror film for a lot of people right on their own TV sets. So it was very inspiring. A lot of people came out with their own artwork, and Wes Craven was one of these people, and he had no problem denying it. I'm going to explain, for those of you who don't know, I'm going to kind of fill you in on his 30-year dynasty and how for 30 years these movies were he pretty much made the model for each scary movie for each decade. So after the Vietnam War, you have a young Wes Craven, and his buddy Sean Cunningham comes to him. And Sean Cunningham, obviously being the creator of Friday the 13th, he asks Wes to do a movie. He says, hey, I got something pretty raw, pretty rugged. I want you to be a part of it. And that movie was The Last House on the Left, 1972. This movie put Wes Craven on the horror map. This movie, it was so raw, people thought it was a real movie. Now, if you're unaware of the movie, in this Last House on the Left, there is rape, there is brutal torture, there's some hard scenes to sit through. And if you can imagine what the audiences would think in 1972, they didn't exactly open it with open arms, or, they didn't have open arms about it. But it was rebellion. It was young people rebelling from what they had saw. If they said, hey, if we can kill boys and put that on TV and watch them die for the army, why can't I make this fake movie? So, when the movie came out, it wasn't necessarily a box, it wasn't a blockbuster box hit, but amongst filmmakers and young horror filmmakers, it was the thing to beat. And it was really interesting because Wes stepped outside of his box, and this isn't, up to that point, you had the movies in the 50s and the 60s, the Hammer films with the monsters, like, your Dracula, Frankenstein, your romanticized monsters. And this was such a step away. It was like the first step away from your George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead, zombies, or monster creatures. These were people in Last House on the Left. This was something that was really what Wes was all about. Wes loved when the crazy spilled into the real life and trying to figure out the difference. His artwork always has symbolism like that. And the way the man thinks, it's brilliant. When you hear him interviewed, there's nobody I've ever heard talk like him in the whole entire world. And you can really see it in his film. So when that first one, Last House on the Left, came out, he was almost kind of shunned from certain places, especially in his hometown, like from his mother and church people. He said it wasn't exactly, people didn't embrace it as well as he thought he would, but he knew what he was getting into. But like I said, it was artwork. He had a quote where he was talking about the symbolism in the movie. There's a scene in the movie where Krueger, the main bad guy, shoots the girl after he raped her, and she's trying to swim away, and he shoots her while she's swimming away in the water. And the way that shot is filmed, Krueger, as he's shooting her, it's just like the photo of the Vietnam man, or the Viet Cong man being shot by the Saigon police chief. was a very famous photo, like National Geographic photo back then. And I was listening to an interview with Wes, and he said that that photo was so powerful that he had that symbolism in the movie with his main bad guy. I mean, this isn't a theory, you know. These are facts. That especially the Vietnam War sparked some great art, and Wes Craven starting it off with The Last House on the Left. And this is kind of, in my eyes, this is when I really started to appreciate horror films. I obviously was not alive in 72, but just in the order of them, the order of the genre, it's when they got dark. When you started to see your Last House on the Lefts and your, Texas Chainsaw Massacres, and that's not Wes Craven, but when you started to see those style films, they were all nodding their hat to this first one, Last House on the Left, because they were the first, and it was hard to watch, and it was great. So after he had this film, people didn't exactly embrace him, and he had some recognition, but he wasn't exactly getting paid yet. So this is the first decade that we're referring to. So this is the first of his three, his triple decade dynasty. And it's 1972, Last House on the Left. And then he follows up at the end of the decade with The Hills Have Eyes. And The Hills Have Eyes is a pretty popular story if you're unfamiliar with it. People out in the middle of the desert in the caves, and some inbred cave people come out and take them hostage. It's a pretty simple concept, but it's still pretty creepy. And Wes Craven said he was able to read a lot, and he loved to read, so he was able to fill his brain with so many stories. And he was inspired with this story by the Hills Have Eyes story by the Shawnee Bean family. And that's like an old legend, the road between Edinburgh and London, and the Bean family, they would snatch people up similar to the Hills Have Eyes. And he said that it resonated with him so much that he made his own movie about it. And that movie's still iconic. Both of these movies in this decade have had remakes, both of which have been successful. So think about that. That's 4 movies. That's his story. And it's pretty wild to start the genre, or to start the decade with the biggest bang, but he did. In this situation, he did. He started the genre, and honestly, I'm not going to say that Texas Chainsaw didn't equal it, because Tobe Hooper did an amazing job, and he made something that was hard to touch and definitely very original. I still give the cake The Last House on the Left for the 70s. I really do. It's just kind of what started it. So Wes started cranking these movies out, and he was definitely getting some notoriety. People were knowing who he was, but he was still teaching. He was still teaching in colleges here and there, just trying to make a few bucks. He wasn't making a whole lot of money. He wasn't doing great. So it was getting to the point, if anybody who's had a hobby or a passion project, he was getting exhausted of it, and things weren't looking well. So he starts to go into the 1980s. And this is what really concreted him, was the 80s. Because he had a slew of great films, some not as great, but once again, he took the crown for the decade, in my opinion. So his big one being A Nightmare on Elm Street, 1984. This is what made him mainstream. This is what, honestly, Freddy Krueger, children still know that name. Think about how many nightmares that movie and that franchise alone has given people. And Wes just created them. He just created them. He knew a neighborhood man that looked similar, kind of that way. He used that plus a story he had read. Once again, Wes reading. He read about an American Indian, or not American Indian, an American immigrant from Cambodia who was afraid to go to sleep and begged his parents not to go to sleep, and he wouldn't sleep. He had a coffee pot in his room. He had sleeping pills. His parents, like the opposite of sleeping pills, I guess caffeine pills to keep himself awake. And he begged his parents, said he didn't want to go to bed, and eventually when he did go to bed, he died in his sleep. And Wes said that after he read 3 similar stories to that story, that's when he decided to write Elm Street. And when he wrote Elm Street, he was still pretty broke, and he was sending out the script once it was finished to people, and he said most people denied it. Most people couldn't understand his genius or what he had going on there, which is wild to think about. People rejected A Nightmare on Elm Street, and they said this will never work, which is pretty funny because they probably feel pretty dumb now. But once the movie came out, it blew up. It went mainstream. Freddy Krueger was a household name, pretty much. So he was finally had the financial freedom to do what he wanted. And what a creative movie. If anybody that's a fan of the Nightmare movies, it's always very neat to kind of see when is it a dream and when it's reality. Because there's never a clear, definite moment. And Wes is great of that, of having that subconscious leak into the conscience. That's what he's all about. Is this real? Is this not? And he really plays on that fear. I was also listening to an interview with him where he was talking about Freddy's glove. And he said it was just a primal fear. He said back when we were cavemen people, he said I was just thinking about what we would have to fight against predators, and it would be tooth and nail. And he said, so I started to think about the claw and how somehow the subconscious has to be aware that that's a weapon. That's deep down to our primitive nature. It was just wild to hear him talk about it. I would never think that way. I would never have thought of that. And he's very brilliant for obviously creating Freddy Krueger, but just the story in general and tying it all together. But he didn't just have Elm Street in the 80s. He had a bunch of great films. I mean, some people, critically, I wouldn't say great, or financially, the way they did, wouldn't say they were great. But as far as stories, Wes Craven made great stories. He made in 1981 he had Deadly Blessing, and that had Sharon Stone in it. That was her first speaking role. So that was very, very cool. There's something with bathtub scenes with Wes Craven that he just loves to do. Especially in the 80s. So if you haven't seen Deadly Blessing, it's definitely worth the watch. One of my favorites, though, besides Elm Street, is Serpent and the Rainbow. And that one came out in 1988, and it's great. It's a movie about voodoo and its origins, but it's not a joke towards it. It's not done like a lampoon by any degree. It's very serious, and it's very cool. Just another creative project of Wes Craven. Once you've seen a catalog of his films, you can just start to see the inside of their brains. I mean, that's how all directors are. But I really love the complexity of Wes. And Serpent and the Rainbow does a wonderful job. You could just kind of watch that movie alone, stand alone, and understand how he thinks. And Swamp Thing, if you guys saw that movie in 1982, that was another great movie from Wes Craven. Just the makeup, the story, it was all great. And maybe not amongst everyday moviegoers, people aren't really remembering 1982 Swamp Thing, but it became a cult film. And you'll see it pop up at these conventions. You'll see t-shirts and posters and even watch parties and viewings of it. And it's not widely known, but it's a great piece of art because it's Wes Craven. And now that he's gone, it's sometimes great to go back and check out some of the stuff we may have missed. And then, actually, I can't not mention this before moving into the next decade, because the second decade we're in now, but he finished in 1989 with the movie The Shocker, and I don't know if you guys remember that, but that's where the guy came out of the TV and he went into the guy through electricity. It was really sweet. It was a really cool movie. It's really kept you on the edge of your seat, and it was a think piece. I mean, a lot of his films are, honestly. But Shocker was great. That was really good. Yeah, and in that movie, he was kind of trying to make a new Freddy. He had so much success with Elm Street, and he was trying to make a new Freddy. But a slew of horror movies within the last, from 72, if you're starting it off, with The Last House on the Left, all the way to The Shocker in 89, that's where we're at. So you have Last House on the Left wearing the crown for the 70s. Or just starting it. In 1984, you have the most intelligent slasher film, in my opinion, with Nightmare on Elm Street. So, he was balling. He was finally doing good. The man's finally getting the recognition that he deserved. He could have probably just tucked away, didn't make any more movies, just live the rest of his life. But that's not what he did. He figured, hey, it's the 90s now. I gotta grow. I gotta adapt. I gotta find out what the kids want, and I gotta find something scary. So he started off in 1992 with People Under the Stairs. I fucking love that movie. That's a great ass... I mean, it's such a good movie. And that's kind of the cool part about Wes Craven, too. He was able to make a movie for Americans. It didn't matter. It wasn't just always the vanilla side of things. He had movie with black people, white people. The narratives were always different. And I love that about it. And People Under the Stairs does not... knowing now, obviously it's a Wes Craven film, but going into it, you wouldn't think, if you were to read it or see the actors in it, you wouldn't think, oh, this is Wes Craven. But it is. Once you watch it, once you put all the pieces together, it's another one of his little brain projects, and it's another pillar in the horror genre. I mean, People Under the Stairs is great. It's not as talked about as much as I'd like it to be done, but shit, even if that was the only one he did in the 90s, you could wrap it up there, and he could have still fucked off and went away forever. And wow, what a filmography, what a career. But that wasn't even his best movie of the decade. The man kept going. 1994, Wes Craven's New Nightmare, the seventh Freddy Krueger, where Freddy Krueger is an actual entity haunting Robert Englund, who plays Freddy Krueger, and Heather Langenkamp, who played Nancy. So now the entity is haunting the actors in real life. That's so goddamn Wes Craven. That's so him. He's spilling the unreal into the real. That's what he loves to do. He loves to play with your brain a little bit. Some people's horror movies, they want to sicken you. They want to make you throw up or be like, ah! He wanted to sicken your mind. He wanted to really torment, your inner fantasies and pervert them. That's what he was all about. So in Wes Craven's New Nightmare, he broke that fourth wall. And that movie, it wasn't necessarily a hit, but it was a success. And it got a lot more love over the years. And especially even after Wes's death, people are going back and seeing it for the first time. Like, whoa, I think that's my favorite Freddy movie. I wouldn't go that far, but it is a great piece of work. but it's still not the best for the decade. The next year, Wes Craven directed Vampire in Brooklyn with Eddie Murphy. Another great movie. I wouldn't say it's exactly a serious horror flick, but Eddie did a good job stepping outside of his box with staying serious to play a vampire. But Wes also did a good enough job at adding enough fear and enough frightening images and good camera work to still make it relevant enough to seem creepy and not just a Saturday Night Live sketch. That's definitely a cool one to watch if you guys haven't ever seen Vampire in Brooklyn. And obviously, that wasn't the best of the genre, or the best of the decade for him either. But it was just a warm-up for what would come the next year. 1996, Wes Craven changed horror once again. He dropped Scream. If you weren't if you guys don't remember how big Scream was in the 90s, it was it. I mean, it was such... I mean, some people trash it, and that's fine. But what it did for the genre, it started everything that decade. There were so many predecessors to follow that film that were just pure blatant rip-offs because it was something so organic and something so new. And it was you can accredit it all to Wes. Fucking caller ID did not become prevalent until after the Scream movies came out. I mean, that's kind of a cool fact to think about. Not only did the man change the way the horror movies were made that year, or for the rest of the decade, next 10 years, he made caller ID relevant. And the great part about Wes Craven is he always stayed relevant, and he always was able to switch. And Scream, the dialogue satirically nodded to the whole genre and all of his previous work before it. You know, but by also making fun of it and the regularities and the stereotypes of it they made fun of. It's just a very brilliant, a very smart film. It's very good. And I liked all... I mean, even the fourth one I liked. But there's something to say about when you can keep all the same actor... or, you know, all the actors together. It really does make a better product in the end. Yeah. When the Screams came out, you know, you had your... I Know What You Did Last Summer... Urban Legend, just a whole slew of movies like that just wanted the success that they had. And it's all Wes, man. It really is. There is no exactly rhyme or reason for the things I talk about here on my show. It's just, I like these things the most. And Wes Craven, hands down, is my favorite director. Because of Nightmare on Elm Street, the first one, 1984, that's my favorite movie of all time. And there's so many films that he made that are just close to my heart and close to so many other people's hearts. Last House on the Left isn't exactly a film that I love for what I'm watching, but I love for what it did for the movies to follow. And the cool part is, too, it didn't just stop after the 90s. It didn't just stop. He made even more movies. Even more movies. I don't know if you guys remember Red Eye. That was the 2005 movie with Cillian Murphy. And, man, that one was really good, too. He just makes frightening movies. Frightening movies. And he didn't stop until he died. And to be honest, that's a really sad time for all of us to think there's not going to be any more stories from him, and there's going to be nothing else creepy from him, but I'm very happy to at least to appreciate the work that he had, and Sloppy Horror Podcast had to give this man an episode just to himself. And that's what I want to do. I want to talk about some directors and some actors, but if we would have a Mount Rushmore of just horror in general, Wes Craven would be on it, but especially for directing. He would have a very big head chiseled on that Mount Rushmore. And the Sloppy Horror Podcast loves Wes Craven, wishes he was still here. And if you guys are unfamiliar with this work, I mean, obviously some people are, so they're chuckling listening to this, but for those of you who aren't, go delve deep, you know? You can get a good feel for who he is. Any directors that you watch, you can watch a couple Quentin Tarantino movies and you have an idea of what his movies are like, or a couple Scorsese. If you're not like that with Wes Craven, I recommend you do it. So, I don't know any other better way to end this episode than a quote from Wes Craven, and it's one of my favorites. So, here it is. You don't enter the theater and pay your money to be afraid. You enter the theater and pay your money to have the fears that are already in you when you go into the theater dealt with and put into a narrative. End quote.